Elders Hollow had a way of keeping secrets, quietly, politely, as if the land itself was bound by some unspoken code. The people were kind, the Winters forgiving, and the bishop's sons, Walter, Miriam, and their daughter Eliza, were the sort of family that made goodness look effortless. Their home, a stately farmhouse just beyond the willow-lined road, stood as a symbol of prosperity and faith. Every Sunday, the church bell would toll thrice, and the bishop's sons would be first through the doors, hands clasped, eyes lowered, faces serene. The bishop's sons had lived in Elders Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, and their home was the heart of it all. Perched at the edge of the town's oldest fields, the farmhouse overlooked rolling green pastures that met the edge of the woods like two old friends shaking hands. When the morning fog settled low, it almost looked as though the earth itself exhaled around their property. It was here, behind that house with its weathered red shutters and whitewashed porch, that Walter Bishop's son decided one summer afternoon to begin restoring the collapsed barn his grandfather had built nearly a century ago. The structure had leaned for years, sagging like a tired old man under the weight of storms and silence. The townsfolk thought it charming, another piece of history too stubborn to fall. But Walter, ever the perfectionist, saw something else, a blemish on the family's spotless legacy, a wound that needed mending. He started with the foundation. The men he hired from town were cautious workers, the kind who spoke little and moved slower with each hour of daylight. They were good people, God-fearing and honest, and they took pride in helping the bishop's sons. By the third day of digging out the debris, they had unearthed the last of the rotted beams. Beneath them, buried under a thick quilt of dirt and tangled roots, one of the shovels struck something that rang with a hollow metallic tone. The sound was so sharp and sudden that even the cicadas stopped their droning. Walter leaned over the pit, brushing the soil away with the careful curiosity of a man unearthing a forgotten relic. What emerged was a ring of stone, smooth, circular, and impossibly well preserved despite its depth. The men cleared the area further, revealing a perfect opening about 3 feet across, lined with ancient masonry. It wasn't marked on any property record or town plan. Elders Hollow had its share of old wells, but none this far north of the river. The oldest men in town, those who still remembered the hollow before electricity and paved roads, claimed there had once been a settlement there before the bishop's sons bought the land. But when pressed, no one could recall what had become of it. The well, it seemed, was a remnant of something much older, something the earth itself had chosen to keep hidden until now. Walter's excitement was immediate. He saw opportunity where others saw unease. "A fine piece of history," he said, his voice ringing with pride as he stood over the dark circle. Miriam, his wife, watched from the porch, her hands twisting in her apron. She didn't like the way the air felt around the thing, thick and still like the moment before a thunderstorm. Even the birds had gone quiet. But Walter was a man of reason, and to him, the world was made of what could be seen, measured, and rebuilt. He called for more hands the next morning, insisting they clean it out and restore it properly. "A well that old might still yield water," he said with a laugh, "and besides, it'll be good for the garden." The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. There was no sound when stones were dropped into it, no echo, no splash, no sense of depth at all. The rope they lowered vanished into the black without tension or end. Some of the men joked that it must lead straight to the other side of the world, others crossed themselves when they thought Walter wasn't looking. One of them, an old mason named Jonas, refused to return after the second day. He claimed the well breathed at night, that he had seen the water inside move though no wind had touched it. Walter dismissed it as nonsense, the talk of a man too fond of superstition. He replaced Jonas with a younger worker, paid double for silence, and continued the project. When the well was finally cleared and fitted with a new frame and bucket, it looked almost beautiful, a piece of history reborn. Walter polished the stone rim until it gleamed pale under the sun, proud of the symmetry and craftsmanship. On the evening it was finished, the bishop's sons invited the neighbors for lemonade and pie to celebrate. Children ran circles around the yard, daring each other to peer over the edge. Every pebble tossed in disappeared soundlessly, swallowed whole. The adults chuckled and told them it was just deep, deeper than any well they'd seen before. Someone joked that maybe it had no bottom at all. Walter's daughter, Eliza, lingered near it after dark. She was a quiet child, the kind who spoke to stray cats and pressed flowers between the pages of her Bible. That night she claimed she heard something, soft, like a hum, or a woman's voice whispering beneath the stone. Her mother hushed her, saying it was only the wind moving through the valley. But when Eliza went to bed, she dreamt of water, black and endless, and the sound of hands knocking faintly from somewhere far below. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. The family's garden bloomed in a riot of color, though the soil hadn't been watered in weeks. The apple tree that hadn't borne fruit in years now sagged under the weight of perfect, gleaming red apples. Walter took it as a sign of good fortune, calling it the well's blessing. The townsfolk, too, marveled at the sight, visiting to see what they called a miracle. No one could explain it, but everyone agreed it was the kind of magic Elders Hollow needed, something pure, something hopeful. Yet the air around the well never seemed right. The smell of damp earth clung to it even under the sun. On certain nights, a thin mist curled up from its mouth and drifted across the bishopson's yard, though the rest of the town remained clear. Miriam began waking in the middle of the night, certain she'd heard a distant cry echoing through the fields. The dog refused to go near the well. But Walter laughed at such things. Old ground, he'd say, old air trap below. That's all. The last time the workers spoke of the well, one of them swore that when he looked into it just before leaving, he saw his own reflection, only it didn't move when he did. Instead, it smiled back at him, wide and patient, before fading into the dark. The man left Elders Hollow that same night without collecting his pay. Walter never mentioned it again. The well remained, silent and open, its dark mouth glimmering faintly under the moonlight, as if waiting for something, or someone, to come closer. The first night the whispers came, Elders Hollow slept soundly beneath a heavy sky. A pale crescent moon hung above the bishopson's farmhouse, casting the well in a silver glow that made the stones glisten as if wet. The wind had died, the trees stood still, and the field swayed only from the weight of their own silence. Walter and Miriam had gone to bed late, satisfied after a long day of visitors marveling at their miracle well. Eliza, however, lay awake, her small hands clutching the edge of her blanket. She swore she could hear something drifting through her window, a voice, faint and slow, like someone speaking underwater. It was so soft she almost thought she had imagined it, but when she closed her eyes, she felt the sound rather than heard it, deep in her chest, steady as a heartbeat. By morning, she told her mother about the voice that called her name. Miriam smiled tightly and said it must have been a dream. But Eliza wasn't the only one who heard it. Down in the town, the miller's wife woke before dawn to what she described as someone praying outside the window. The blacksmith swore he heard a woman humming from behind his forge, though when he stepped out to look, the air was empty and cold. By the third night, the whispers had spread to nearly every corner of Elders Hollow. They came from no single direction, seeping instead from the stillness itself, from wells, from chimneys, from the open mouths of the sleeping. Some said the voices sounded like loved ones long gone, others claimed they spoke in tongues no one had heard before. The air carried them easily, as if the hollow itself had learned to breathe. Walter refused to believe in such nonsense. Sound carries in strange ways at night, he said over breakfast, his tone calm but impatient. There's no mystery in it. He was a practical man, and the idea that something invisible could move through his property unsettled him more than he would admit. Still, he went out to the yard after dusk to test it for himself, standing beside the well as the world fell into shadow. The air was cool and damp. He called into the darkness once, twice, and waited. No answer came, only the faintest ripple of sound, as though the stones below had sighed. He laughed it off and went inside, but Miriam noticed his hand shaking as he poured his drink. As the days passed, the voices grew bolder. What began as a whisper turned to a low murmur that threaded through the streets like the hum of a hive. People started avoiding the Bishopsons' property after sunset, claiming the voices were loudest there. Some swore that if you stood near the well long enough, the whispers began to form words that weren't your own. They didn't echo, they responded. One boy said the voice knew his name, another that it asked for a gift. No one dared stay to find out what it meant. By the end of the week, a tension had settled over Elders Hollow like dust over forgotten furniture. The townsfolk began locking their doors earlier. The laughter that once filled the square after Sunday service was replaced by the quiet rustle of unease. Only the bishop's son seemed untouched by fear, their days moving forward as if nothing strange had happened. But the truth was different behind closed doors. Miriam stopped sleeping altogether. She would sit in the kitchen through the small hours of the morning, a candle burning beside her, her gaze fixed on the window. She said she could hear footsteps circling the house at night, slow and deliberate. Walter checked each morning, no prints, no sign of trespass. Yet the grass near the well was always damp, even when the rest of the yard was dry. Eliza began speaking less, her once bright chatter replaced by silence. One afternoon, her teacher sent word that the child had been caught whispering to herself in class. When asked who she was speaking to, Eliza said, "The lady in the well." She said the lady told her stories, about the time before the town, about people who had built houses where the fields now stood, and about how they had gone back to sleep. Miriam forbade her from going near the well again, but the next morning, she found Eliza standing beside it barefoot, her nightdress soaked to the knees. When asked why she had gone there, the girl simply said, "She called me." Rumors began to spread that the bishop's sons had brought something back when they opened the well. The pastor tried to calm the town, reminding everyone that faith was stronger than fear, but even he avoided walking past the Bishopson's gate after dark. The whispers had started following people home, curling through keyholes and cracks in the walls, clinging to dreams. The hollow was changing in small, invisible ways. The animals grew restless. The air near the river carried a metallic tang, and every mirror in town seemed to fog slightly around midnight. One evening, as the sun slipped below the hills, Walter stood at his window and looked out at the well. He saw movement, subtle, slow. The air above it shimmered as if with heat, though the night was cold enough to frost the grass. A shape seemed to waver there, something like a figure bending over the stones. He blinked, and it was gone. That same night, he woke to find the house cold as a cellar. The whispering filled every corner now, no longer distant or uncertain but clear, rhythmic, and deliberate. He went downstairs, heart pounding, and found the back door open. The air outside was heavy, sweet with decay. From the yard came the sound of someone breathing. He stepped forward, calling out into the dark, but the voice that answered wasn't his wife's or his daughter's, it was something else, speaking low from the edge of the well. The words were broken, almost gentle, "Thank you for opening the door." He froze, staring into the black mouth below. The whisper rose again, joined by others, dozens of them, until the air itself seemed alive with sound. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and unnatural. When he looked down, the water at the bottom glimmered faintly, reflecting not the sky, but something moving deep beneath its surface. The voices didn't return that night, But Elder's Hollow woke different the next morning, its air heavy with something that felt like memory, or warning, or both. When the whispers began to fade, something else took their place, something that seemed to hum beneath the surface of Elder's Hollow like a current of unseen fortune. The bishop's sons, once ordinary in their modest wealth, started to change in quiet, remarkable ways. It began with the garden, the same one that had already bloomed strangely out of season. Now it grew faster, thicker, richer. Vegetables sprang from the soil overnight, ripe and heavy with color. Flowers opened and never wilted, their petals slick with dew that shimmered even in the dark. Miriam sold a few bunches at the market, and people whispered about the beauty of them, the smell, sweet and faintly metallic, unlike anything else. By the end of that week, the Bishopson's produce fetched 3 times its worth, and soon every home in Elder's Hollow had something of theirs, a jar of preserves, a bouquet, a bushel of their unnaturally red apples. Walter's lumber business, too, flourished without explanation. Orders poured in from neighboring towns, more than he could fill. The weather seemed to bend around his work, where others fought rain and rot, his timber stayed dry and perfect. Even his debts, long-standing ones from a rough winter years ago, vanished overnight when the bank records mysteriously showed them as paid in full. He laughed about it, claiming it was providence or luck or perhaps a reward for his hard work. But when the banker mentioned that the handwriting on the payment slip didn't match his own, Walter's laughter thinned, and he said no more about it. Miriam, though uneasy, couldn't deny the way their lives seemed to be rising like bread under an unseen hand. Her husband looked younger somehow, his face less lined, his step more sure. Eliza's once pale skin glowed with a strange vitality, her eyes brighter, sharper, almost too aware for a child her age. The house itself seemed to hum faintly at night, the walls warm to the touch as though something beneath them was alive. There was no explanation anyone could give, and yet no one wanted to question good fortune. The bishop's sons had always been good people, are generous, faithful, and kind. If they were blessed now, wasn't that simply right? But blessings have weight, and the Hollow began to feel it. Around the same time the Bishopson's fortunes rose, the rest of the town began to wane. It started small, the butcher's livestock grew thin, the baker's yeast failed to rise, and the mill's will slowed though the river still ran strong. The pastor fell ill, his voice weak and trembling when he preached. A grey pallor settled over the faces of Elder's Hollow, while the bishop's son seemed untouched by the sickness that moved through the streets like fog. People still smiled at them, of course. Elder's Hollow was a polite place, but behind those smiles, suspicion began to root. The whispers returned in fragments, not from the well this time, but from the mouths of those who dreamt of it. Several townsfolk claimed they heard voices in their sleep murmuring the Bishopson's name, soft and reverent, like a prayer or a warning. Others said the whispers came from the old pipes when they washed their hands or drew water for cooking. The sound was faint but constant, always circling back to the same rhythm, the same phrase, "The gift must be kept." When asked what it meant, no one could say. Miriam tried to ignore it. She busied herself with chores, but the unease wouldn't fade. One night, unable to sleep, she went out to the garden. The moon hung low, casting everything in pale blue. The well stood silent, its rope swaying gently though there was no wind. She saw something strange then, small indentations in the soil, as if someone had been walking barefoot between the rows of plants. The prints were wet, glistening faintly as if touched by something from deep underground. She followed them to the edge of the well and froze. The bucket, which they never used anymore, was half raised, dripping thick water that smelled faintly of iron. For a long moment, she simply watched the liquid pool at her feet. Then, from below, came the sound of a sigh, long, content, almost human. She turned and ran inside, her nightdress clinging damply to her ankles. The next morning, Walter announced they'd had their best month in years. He looked jubilant, his hands trembling with excitement. He told Miriam that people from neighboring towns were sending word of their prosperity, that the Bishopsons' name was being spoken with admiration far beyond Elders Hollow. He took this as proof of their righteousness, but Miriam saw only the hollowness behind his eyes. His laughter didn't sound quite like his own anymore. It was softer, deeper, and it didn't stop when it should. Meanwhile, the townsfolk began to notice how the Bishopsons' good fortune came at a cost none of them could name. The blacksmith's youngest son vanished one morning on his way to the river. A week later, the grocer's wife fell ill and never recovered. Each time tragedy struck, the Bishopsons' fields grew greener, their flowers brighter, their home more radiant under the light. People whispered that perhaps the well took what it gave, that for every blessing above, something below had to be fed. Still, no one dared confront Walter directly. The Bishop's sons were too loved, too powerful now. And when those who spoke against them began to disappear, the rest learned silence. Eliza, the child once so sweet and timid, began to change as well. She spent hours near the well, humming softly to herself, her small fingers trailing along the stone rim as if tracing something written there. Miriam tried to keep her away, but the girl would always find her way back. "They're kind to us," she told her mother once. "They just want to be remembered." When Miriam asked who she meant, Eliza smiled and said, "The ones below." The town grew dimmer in contrast to the Bishopsons' brilliance. Crops withered, wells dried, and the air carried a sour taste of iron and decay. Yet the Bishop's sons thrived. Their fruit glowed red as blood, their house burned with warmth while others shivered through early frost. The pastor's final sermon was whispered through fevered lips, warning that no light shines without casting shadow. The next morning, his body was found near the river, his eyes open and his mouth full of dirt. When word reached the Bishop's sons, Walter bowed his head in sorrow, but there was no grief in his face, only calm acceptance. He said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," though his gaze drifted toward the window where the well sat just beyond view. That night, as he raised a glass in the dim light of their kitchen, Miriam thought she heard it again, the faint sound of water moving somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, slow and steady, like breathing. By the time the drought came, Elders Hollow was already a ghost of the town it had been. The streets that once rang with laughter now echoed only with the sound of dry wind scraping against the window panes. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay, and every breath carried the faint taste of iron. The Bishopsons' well, once the marvel of the hollow, stood at the center of it all, dark, silent, and watching. It had not been touched in weeks, though Miriam swore she still heard it shifting at night, as if something below stirred in its depths. Then, one morning, the town awoke to a smell that no one could ignore. It began as a faint stench, like something spoiled beneath the summer sun, drifting through the air from the Bishopsons' property. By midday it thickened, sour and metallic, clinging to every breath. Those who lived closest said it came from the well, though none dared approach to see. The Bishop's sons themselves seemed strangely unaffected. Walter went about his work as usual, his boots leaving dark prints on the parched ground, while Miriam moved through the house in silence, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Eliza played in the garden as though nothing had changed, her laughter too bright, too sharp against the oppressive stillness that surrounded them. The town's water, once drawn sweet and clear from the river and private wells, began to turn foul. It first appeared as a discoloration, an amber tint that darkened each day until it ran nearly black. It smelled faintly of rust, and when left in a glass overnight, it left behind a film that shimmered like oil. The townsfolk panicked, believing the drought had poisoned the supply. But the Bishopsons' water remained clear. When people asked how, Walter simply said their well was deeper than the rest, untouched by the troubles above. He offered to share what they had, and though many accepted, some noticed something off about the water. It felt heavy in the mouth, warm even when drawn fresh, and left a taste that lingered long after drinking. Yet it sustained them. And so, they drank. It was during this time that the hollow began to lose its sound. The bird stopped singing first. The crickets followed. Even the church bell, when struck, seemed muted, its echo swallowed by the still air. People started vanishing, first the miller's daughter, then two brothers who worked the far fields. Search parties were formed, but the ground had grown too hard to dig, the river too low to follow. Only the wind carried their names, whispering them across the empty streets like prayers that would never be answered. Walter said little of it, except that times of hardship revealed who truly had faith. Miriam no longer attended church. She spent her days scrubbing the floors, though they never seemed clean, and her nights sitting by the window with her hands pressed to her ears. She said the whispers had returned, only now they came from beneath the house, from the pipes, from the walls. Sometimes she heard the sound of dripping, slow and steady, though nothing in the house was leaking. Once, she woke to find the floorboards damp beneath her feet, the water black and glistening like ink. She begged Walter to leave, to take Eliza and go, but he refused. "The well provides," he said, his voice calm and strange. "It takes care of us." The townspeople had begun to talk openly now. They said the bishop's sons had cursed the hollow, that the well had taken more than it gave. Some claimed to see movement in the fog near the bishop's sons' fields, shapes that crawled or limped, glimmering faintly as though wet. Others swore they heard voices rising from the bishop's sons' yard after midnight, murmuring low hymns that no one could understand. When a group of men went to confront Walter, they found the farmhouse dark but for one flickering light in the kitchen. The smell hit them before they reached the porch, a stench so thick it made their eyes water. They knocked once, twice, but no one came. And from somewhere deep inside the house came a faint sound like the dragging of chains. It was the next morning when the well was discovered empty. The bishop's son's farmhand, who arrived at dawn to tend the garden, found the bucket rope dangling limp and frayed. The well that had once seemed endless now yawned open, dry and hollow. No glimmer of water reflected the light. Only the smell remained, sharp, metallic, unbearable. When word spread through the hollow, a crowd gathered at the bishop's son's gate. Walter stood before them, calm as ever, his face smeared faintly with dirt or something darker. He told them that the well had served its purpose, that it had given all it could. His voice was slow, deliberate, as though reciting something he had memorized long ago. "It's not gone," he said. "It's just moved deeper." The crowd demanded answers about the missing, about the foul air, about the sickness spreading through the town, but Walter only smiled. He told them that everything taken would soon be returned, that the hollow would be made whole again. The words sounded like comfort, but his eyes were wrong, flat and distant, like the reflection on still water before a storm. When the people tried to approach, he stepped back toward the well. The smell grew stronger, and those nearest the rim swore they heard movement below, a faint shifting, like something vast stirring in the dark. That night, the wind returned to Elder's Hollow for the first time in weeks. It came hard and sudden, tearing through the streets and fields, lifting dust and ash into the air. Doors slammed open, candles blew out, and the town's single church bell rang without being touched. The bishop's son's lights burned late into the night, and those who lived close enough said they saw shadows moving in the windows, more than 3, far more. By morning, the house was quiet. The air still carried that smell, heavier now, sweet beneath the rot, and the well behind their home was darker than it had ever been. The rope hung limp, swaying slightly though no wind stirred. When one of the braver men dared peer inside, he saw nothing, no water, no reflection, only the faint shimmer of something wet clinging to the stones, pulsing softly, as if breathing. The morning the townspeople decided to drain the Bishopsons' well, the sky was the color of ash. The air hung thick with the scent of rain that would not fall, and every step across the parched ground seemed to echo too loudly. No one spoke as they gathered outside the Bishopsons' farmhouse. The once white walls of the home were now stained grey with damp, the shutters sagging like tired eyelids. Walter Bishopson stood on the porch, motionless, his hands clasped before him as though he were waiting for a sermon to begin. His wife was nowhere to be seen, and little Eliza stood beside him in silence, her eyes fixed on the well. When the crowd approached, she smiled faintly, a strange, knowing curve of her lips that made the men hesitate before taking another step. They came with ropes, pulleys, and barrels, determined to uncover what lay beneath. The town had reached its breaking point. Too many had gone missing, too many had fallen ill, and the Bishopsons' calm defiance had begun to feel like mockery. The well's water had vanished overnight, leaving behind only the stench of rot that choked the air. The townsfolk told themselves they would find the source of the corruption, that they would cleanse it, but none said aloud what they truly feared, that they would find their dead. As they began to work, the sound of the rope scraping against stone filled the yard. A makeshift crank was built to lower a man into the well, but none volunteered. Walter watched in silence until finally, one of the younger men, Thomas Gray, stepped forward. His father had vanished 2 weeks earlier, last seen walking the path that led past the Bishopsons' fields. Thomas tied the rope around his waist, his face pale but determined. As he descended into the dark, the crowd leaned in, their faces white and still in the dim light. The rope creaked, the smell grew stronger, and somewhere deep below, the sound of dripping returned, slow, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock buried underground. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rope moving through hands. Then Thomas's voice echoed up from the depths, faint, trembling, but clear. "There's something here," he called. "It's not, there's no water, just mud." The rest was lost in a muffled gasp, followed by a noise no one could place, a low groan that seemed to come not from Thomas, but from the stones themselves. The rope went taut, jerking once, twice, before falling slack. The men pulled frantically, shouting his name, their arms burning as they heaved. When the rope finally came free, it was wet and heavy. What returned was not Thomas, but his harness, torn clean through as if by something far stronger than human hands. The lower half of the rope glistened red. Panic rippled through the crowd. Some screamed, others prayed. Walter remained still. His expression did not change, but his lips began to move, shaping words no one could hear. Eliza began to hum, a soft, eerie tune that wound its way through the chaos like smoke. The men backed away from the well, afraid to look inside, yet drawn to it all the same. From its depths came a faint vibration, the sound of something shifting, something vast and wet, pulling against the earth. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Cracks spread through the dry soil like veins. Then, slowly, a dark liquid began to rise within the well. It wasn't water, it was thicker, darker, and carried a shimmer that caught the dying light. Someone shouted to stop it, to seal it, but it was too late. The substance spilled over the rim, running in thin streams that hissed as they touched the ground. Wherever it flowed, the earth darkened, softening as if feeding. The smell was unbearable now, a mixture of blood and metal, of something ancient unearthed too soon. Miriam Bishopson appeared then, stepping out from the doorway as if she had been waiting all along. Her dress was stained at the hem, her hands trembling. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind that had begun to rise. "You don't understand. It asked to be emptied." Her words froze the crowd. Behind her, the house flickered with light, as if fire burned within but gave off no smoke. Walter turned to her slowly, his face drained of color. "It was promised," he said, and for the first time his voice cracked. It needed to be remembered. He stepped toward the well, reaching out a hand as if to calm it. The liquid pulsed in response, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of a heart. Then came the sound, the one that would haunt the town forever, the sound of voices. Hundreds of them, whispering from within the well, each distinct yet woven together into one endless chant. The words were not in any language the townsfolk knew, but they carried weight, a deep and terrible reverence. Someone screamed for everyone to run. The crowd scattered, tripping over one another in their panic, but some stayed frozen, unable to look away. As the chanting grew louder, shapes began to form within the liquid, faces pressing against its surface, eyes open and mouths moving in time with the whispers. They weren't just faces, they were familiar. The missing, the dead, the ones taken. Thomas Gray's eyes blinked among them, hollow and unseeing. The crowd wailed, retreating toward the edge of the property, but the well kept rising, spilling over until the ground around it turned soft and black. When the first man fell, pulled down by something unseen, the rest broke. They fled into the fields, some not stopping until they reached the far end of town. When they looked back, the Bishopson's farmhouse was half swallowed in shadow, its windows glowing red as if lit from below. Miriam and Eliza stood at the threshold, unmoving, while Walter knelt beside the well, his hand submerged in the black water. The voices were deafening now, the chant breaking into cries, laughter, weeping, all at once. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. By morning, the storm had come. Rain fell hard and unending, washing the dust from the hollow and soaking the ground until it bled into mud. When the bravest of the townsfolk returned, the Bishopson's house was gone. Only the foundation remained, and in its center, the well, emptied, silent, and clean. No bodies, no blood, only the faint shimmer of something slick at the bottom. But the earth around it pulsed faintly, as if something beneath still breathed. The townspeople sealed it with stone and blessed the ground, vowing never to speak of it again. Yet, as the years passed, no crops grew on that soil. The air there stayed colder, and those who lingered too close swore they could still hear faint voices rising through the cracks, whispering names, always starting with Bishop's son.